So, on to tonight's presentation, which I know you're all dying to hear. Pioneer Cemetery and Riverside Cemetery from 1850 to 2025, presented by Gwen Sargent. Gwen is an Appleton native, born and raised here, attended Lawrence University, and graduated in the sesquicentennial class, and she can spell that for you. Gwen's family has been in Appleton since 1854. Not her personally, but the family. She runs the family business, the Appleton Bike Shop, which has been in Appleton since 1939. It's not in my notes, but if you want to call there, it's 733-2595 is the phone number. You can ask me later why I remember that number. Gwen and her husband, Joe, have 3 children. Gwen enjoys all things local history, and she's currently the president of the Appleton Historical Society and volunteers their time at Riverside Cemetery as well. Without further ado, Gwen.
Get into it. I hear the Brewers are playing tonight, so that throws off the process here. So I see that there's some telephones, and we're watching along here. Nice. All right. So we'll get to hear later how those Brewers are doing. So. All right, tonight I will be presenting the history of the Appleton Cemetery Association from the Appleton Pioneer Cemetery to Riverside Cemetery, Appleton. The Appleton Cemetery Association is tied to Appleton's rich history. Pioneer Cemetery is a ghost of the past, and Riverside Cemetery a historical gem still existing today. This is by no means an exhaustive look at the history of the Cemetery Association. I could spend many, many more hours searching the depths of the minutes to create an even more extensive history, and it's likely I probably will spend many, many more hours researching the depths of the history. The first recorded cemetery funeral, the first recorded funeral in Appleton took place on October 15th, 1849. The child of H.N. Day had passed away. Reverend Asa B. Randall preached and then assisted in burying. The location, according to the Methodist logbooks, was on the farm of Newman Blood by the bank of a creek, now owned by William Morton. The location of the land was 21 North, 17 East, and Section 26. This 160 acres was bounded by Richmond Street, Wisconsin Avenue, Oneida Street, and Packard. The Mill Creek Ravine runs through this area. I can only think that this is likely to be the bank of the creek they referred to. When that first burial took place, I imagine in that moment they had to consider how and where they would bury the dead in the future. The first cemetery was a community endeavor. It was laid out on 2 acres donated by Amos and Sarah Lawrence on the western part of the old Appleton Platte. It was a section of land northwest of the intersection of North Brown Street, we know that as Superior today, and West Edward Street, which we know as Washington Street. The slide shows the inset of the 1853 map. This map was given to the Appleton Public Library by Mrs. Greeno. The photograph is an 1867 stereograph. You can see the Hercules School, which is also on the map. You can also see the church on the left, the Episcopal Church, and the church on the right, across from the school, is the First Baptist. Behind the churches by a city block is where the Pioneer Cemetery would be located. So this building is Hercules, and so right back in there is where the cemetery was located at that point. 1867 that photo is. And then this is an inset of the other map, so you can see a little more clearly where the Pioneer Cemetery was located. The cemetery extended west to what we know as Division Street today and was bordered on the north side by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad tracks. And Fisk Street, we know that as Franklin today. Mr. James Blood owned a small piece of land between the cemetery and the ravine on the west side. A number of people hoped to be able to bury their friends there, but it turned out it was too expensive to buy the land from Mr. Blood, so they gave up on the idea of putting an addition onto the old cemetery. I had nearly given up on finding more information about the Pioneer Cemetery, but in 2024, a donation came into the museum which included a map of the original Pioneer Cemetery. When you put them side by side with the 1872 map, you can use the ravine as a guide for the orientation of the map. John Stevens was the surveyor, and it was witnessed by Jackson Tibbetts, president of the Appleton Cemetery Association, and Frederick Packard, the secretary, on November 8, 1855. Received and recorded by J.S. Buck and T.P. Bingham. The Appleton Cemetery Association would be 175 years old in 2025. So you can kind of see how the ravine runs through there, and the ravine runs through there. So I can't help but think maybe there are more records out there that'll illuminate even further the old cemetery in the future. All right. The first burial in the Pioneer Cemetery in 1850 was Erasmus Beach. The second, Amelia Bateman, a student who died of typhoid fever. Amelia was noted as being one of Appleton's fairest flowers. Over 700 people were buried in the Pioneer Cemetery altogether between 1850 and 1872. This slide is an inset of a hand-drawn map of 1874, which shows you the tiniest of headstones below the trees. An editorial appeared in 1853 in the Crescent by Sam Ryan Jr. Our village cemetery. It seems that the place of burial for the dead of Appleton is owned by a cemetery association. We paid a visit to the spot a few evenings since, and we were pleased to find it occupying such a beautiful location. We now suggest to the directors and trustees that the grounds should be laid out into lots with suitable walks and alleys, and the brush cleared off, leaving sufficient quantity of trees for ornament and shade, and the whole enclosed by a neat and substantial fence. The Appleton Cemetery Association met on January 2, 1854, and responded to the editorial. Mr. Editor, the Appleton Cemetery Association is in existence. The trustees in 1854 included Jackson Tibbetts, P.H. Smith, R.A. Law, A.B. Bowen, Robert Bateman, A.C. Darling, George Lamphere, Frederick Packard, and James Gilmore. The trustees plan to meet the first day of March to measure, survey, and fence the area of the Pioneer Cemetery. Late in 1854, the cemetery was greatly beautified according to Ryan's History of Outagamie County. Appleton became a city in May of 1857, and the cemetery was a political topic of the day in the Amos Story campaign. Discussions were already underway about the current location of the cemetery, its size, its place in the community. Amos Story passed away in 1862 and was buried in the Pioneer Cemetery. Mayor Gilmore, a cemetery trustee, carried the same interest in having a sufficient place for the dead to rest. In 1862, Mayor Johnson gave a speech. Johnson talked about the cemetery being a liability. It would be outgrown, and economically, it was in the Cemetery Association's best interest to buy a new site. After many years of back and forth discussions listed in the newspaper, in May of 1870, City Council approved looking for a new location for the cemetery. Mayor A.L. Smith appointed Aldermen Gilmore, Buck, and Harriman, and Messrs. Spalding and H.L. Blood. 1870 is the date that they chose as the new chapter in the cemetery history, which eventually became Riverside Cemetery. Judge Joseph Harriman, a member of the committee, is most often pointed to as the leader of the progress on the new cemetery. The new cemetery, we know as Riverside Cemetery, is 155 years old this year. July 23, 1870, an article appeared in the Crescent entitled, "A City Without a Cemetery." Such a city is Appleton, almost. The Crescent goes on to describe the Pioneer Cemetery. Take away some 2 acres of clayey ground near the depot, surrounded by a coarse board fence without walk or adornment, either natural or artificial, and Appleton is literally a city without a cemetery. The need of a new cemetery is not a new discovery. It has long been confused. The present cemetery is of insufficient size. There are now but few vacant lots except in the ravine of a great cost. It's interesting because they went back and forth throughout 1870 with citizens not quite realizing that the city had already chosen to look for the new location because they had not yet acquired it. They went on to say, and further, it is seldom that a place of burial so near to a business is left so long. The town is fast growing in a direction. Men do not like to have gravestones opposite their front doors. They also don't want their bones dug up to be used as a hitching post or a place to put your beer near the saloon. I thought these were pretty funny quotes from the newspaper in that era, where the citizens were pushing to get the land actually purchased and move forward. So the Crescent appears to be giving the community that push to get the land purchased. There's also a push to maintain the old cemetery. August 1870, the Cemetery Association was investigated and the books reviewed. James Gilmore was the treasurer and secretary at the time. According to the statute, a meeting of stockholders couldn't be held until the first Monday in January, at which time the new board would be chosen. The association needed to remove a large portion of trees, maintain the walks, and put in a good fence. Everyone who purchased the lot could vote to see the desirable result. Leading up to the Cemetery Association annual meeting in 1871, the Cemetery Association asked that lot owners paid special attention to the election of the Board of Trustees. All who paid for lots should come prepared to vote. After the new board is organized, undoubtedly, all will be served with notice to pay for their lots or remove their dead. So here the pressure's on to start thinking about where they're going to move to. In 1871, the Appleton Cemetery Association was reorganized and recognized by an act of the Wisconsin State Legislature. These are the notes from the minutes of the Appleton Cemetery Association as they did that reorganization in 1871. Jackson Tibbetts, Samuel Ryan, Nathaniel Edwards, James Reeve, Joseph Harriman, James Hutchison, William Brightong, William Wharton, Cosby Ketchum were elected as the trustees at that meeting, February 20th, 1871, and the association was officially legalized. March 14th, 1871, the legislature made that official. In the spring of 1872, the city set apart 20 acres for the purpose of the cemetery. So the purchase of the land happened in 1872. So this is when we first see the new 20 acres of Riverside Cemetery. They set apart those 15 acres and they retained 5 acres for the Potter's Field. The main entrance came from 2nd Avenue. We know that is Wisconsin Avenue. The road coming in was called Cemetery, as it led from 2nd Avenue. At this point, Brook Street, also known as Pacific, did not have a bridge across the ravine, and the river route on Green Bay Road was often washed out. Captain Ed Edwards set about platting the initial 15 acres for sale into blocks and lots. The lots were in 12 grave sections. The lots sold for $10 without perpetual care. The initial lot sales took place in the fall of 1872. J.E. Harriman, secretary and treasurer, noted at the Appleton Crescent that the sale of those lots secured the inauguration of improvements on the grounds in a grand and beautiful scale, so tastefully and elegantly represented on the plot. The Crescent went on, "Reader, it is in your interest and to the interest of your friends that you select and secure a lot now, while the prices are low and the desirable locations are available. The secretary of the association will be present at the cemetery from 2 to 4 o'clock each afternoon until July 1st. He will have a chart and he will give all the information desired." The first burial at Riverside Cemetery was that of Reverend Thomas Orbison on November 10th, 1872. At that time of his burial, his wife was distraught over the thought of him being buried in a lonely place. In 1872, 3 more persons joined Reverend Orbison at Riverside Cemetery: John Bear, Emma Vole, and Samuel Myers. It wouldn't be long before many would join his company along the Fox River. If you attended the cemetery walk this year, you saw Reverend and Susan Orbison were featured with the unveiling of the replacement cemetery stone, a replica of the original. Thank you to Dave Buss, who led the way in raising funds to make that happen, and to the Orbison family and the staff at Riverside Cemetery who supported the project. So I've got here the original stone there. It was not in good condition in the ground, and this is the new stone. It was a replica of the original, and then Susan's stone was raised up as well. So pretty neat. J.E. Harriman hired the first superintendent of Riverside Cemetery, Dennis Midam. The designs of Captain Edwards were carried out by Professor Yoakum. The lots, avenues, drives, and paths were laid out with the necessary improvements under the direction of J.E. Harriman. The Appleton Crescent noted that Riverside will be by far the most attractive cemetery in the valley of the Fox River. I do agree it is the most attractive. In the fall of 1873, 20 to 30 persons were removed from the old Pioneer Cemetery to Riverside. Among them were Anson Ballard and children, Reverend Dickinson, Mr. Jerry Grand, Mrs. Sam Ryan, and Mrs. Robertson, and more. Next season, more will be removed. It appears often in the papers the request for families to arrange to move their dead loved ones to the new cemetery. The New Cemetery Association begins plans for adding additional acreage and beautification. The Crescent delights in saying Appleton likes to be ahead in everything. Let us therefore hope that her citizens will not be negligent in expenditures for beautifying the last resting place of their loved ones. In 1874, they commenced improving the street on the river route to the cemetery. This street is called Green Bay Road. Green Bay Road was called such because it led all the way up to Green Bay. It was a Native American and French Creole route along the river. Today we call that Old Green Bay Road. It's a bit more of a trail these days going up on the cemetery's property there. This photo is from 2017, taken about from the bottom and then about halfway up. In the back, you can see the Conkey family monument at the top. So recently, the cemetery has done a lot of work, so this actually looks quite a bit different today. So you might want to go out there and walk some of that and see a lot of that foliage has been taken down and kind of cleaned up. It's really quite beautiful. So, at the annual meeting of 1875, trustees were elected. They included N.M. Edwards, Samuel Ryan, Jackson Tibbetts, Captain Spaulding, Horton, Harriman, Reeve, Goff, and Erb. In October of 1875, 145 burials had taken place at the new Riverside Cemetery, with 32 of them being reinterments removed from the old cemetery. At this time, there were a large number of beautiful monuments, among them Mr. Mudridge, Mrs. Fenning, Louis Bonneau, Julius Buck, Mrs. Patton, J.H. Carver, H.H. Babcock, Mrs. Orbison, Sam Ryan, Butler, Hutchison, Briggs, Hobart, Ryan, Robertson, and Lyon. Powers and Hume, the proprietors of Appleton Marble Works, furnished many of the elegant and beautiful designs. The Appleton Post said the quality of their work is unsurpassed. The appearance of Riverside Cemetery furnishes ample evidence of their taste and skill. So I just went out and grabbed a couple of them. This is the Buck Monument out there, a couple of the different monuments that are out there. There's so many that are really quite beautiful. So the Crescent, October 21st, 1875, has this to report. We allude to the subject so frequently that some may think us persistent in constantly keeping it before our readers. It has become established anything that people's tastes, culture, and refinement may be easily ascertained by visiting their cemeteries. Just in proportion as these resting places of the dead are for the beautification, may the citizens of the town be credited with the refinement that education, association, and culture brings. The newspaper is often quoted talking about the beauty of Riverside Cemetery and how important that was to the community, which I think is a neat piece of that history. So, all right. Messrs. Berg and Arndt were contracted to complete the grading on the new northern route to Riverside Cemetery. A new, easier grade was made from North Street to Green Bay Street with a new culvert put at the ravine crossing. Now there wasn't a danger of it being washed out. The drive is open to the public and is one of the most beautiful in the city. Judge Harriman is tireless in his efforts to make the cemetery attractive and approaches pleasant. 1875, word comes that the cattle are constantly breaking into the old cemetery. The fences are dilapidated and there is not a fund from which to pay for the needed repairs, unless the Common Council should decide to make an appropriation. Another push is made for persons to remove their old relatives from the cemetery because the cattle constantly break in. 1876, Mayor Harriman adds 12 acres to the Riverside Cemetery plot. Dennis Midum, superintendent of the cemetery, has cleared out the underbrush, created the avenues of the plat, dug the ravines to run throughout the cemetery for drainage and for appearance. The ravines will add immense beauty to the ground. The Crescent said the hand-built ravines bore a striking resemblance to the natural landscape of the area. 1877, the Crescent noticed the additional work laid out by Harriman. The cemetery saw many improvements, including the monument erected by O.W. Clark. The first greenhouses were built south of Block M, with Dennis Midum in charge. Throughout the years, the cemetery ran a greenhouse. The greenhouse brought in more funding than the lot sales at that time. So here we see it up in the front, but actually the original greenhouse was located back here, and they actually moved it a little bit forward so it would be at the end of the trolley line right there. 1878. David Smith's monument has arrived. This was reported in all the newspapers as it was the big news of the day. A sketch was shown in the newspaper. It was made in his native Scotland, and the material was the best Scotch granite. The Crescent said it will serve to greatly beautify Riverside Cemetery. I think I read somewhere it was like 5,000 pounds. I'm trying to picture how you got that all the way to Appleton. That had to be quite the undertaking. The decision was made in 1879 that trustees of Riverside Cemetery would remove the remains of the soldiers from the old cemetery to the new. The decision was announced at the Common Council meeting to make preparations to commemorate Decoration Day. The announcement was made by O.W. Clark, P.J. Circle, clerk, and E.C. Goff, president of the Riverside Cemetery Association. The Grand Army of the Republic acquired several lots at Riverside and Block K for the soldiers' burials. These are a list of those first soldiers in 1879 that were either buried there or moved over there. In 1880, we caught up with our first vandals listed in the newspaper. 2 women were prosecuted for willfully and wantonly mutilating choice shrubbery in Riverside Cemetery. You cannot pick the flowers in the sacred ground. Section 443 RS established that punishment for such things would be imprisonment for no more than 3 months or a fine not exceeding $100. Trying to imagine that, 3 months for picking the flowers. Whew. That's steep. This is the Reed Monument to in 2017 as well. But that is the Alexander J. Reed and Alice. If you're familiar with Alicia Park, that is that family. In 1888, the greenhouses were moved to a more accessible location at the end of the streetcar line. The Cemetery Association erected the new greenhouse. Dennis Midum was in charge of the greenhouse and all the profits for the beautification of the cemetery. The streetcar began operations in 1886 from Appleton Junction to Riverside Cemetery. The greenhouses were eventually sold in 1908. After many years and many requests made by the Cemetery Association, in March of 1889, the state legislature required the city of Appleton to pay to move the last bodies from the old cemetery. The city agreed to pay $8 per removal and interment. No remains shall be left undiscovered. They estimated that there were between 200 to 300 bodies left to be moved. The process of moving began again in 1889 and continued. In November of 1891, Dennis Midam and a force of 4 men were engaged to move the bodies of an additional 6 to 8 people to Riverside Cemetery. The old burials were near the Northwest Depot. One of the graves opened dated back to 1850 and was one of the oldest in the city. The persons were reinterred in the Potter's Field of the city. Part of that actually washed away a bit with some excessive rain, and so then at that point, Dennis asked if he would be able to bury the poor throughout the cemetery, which would be a more discreet method, and the city approved. So rather than having a specific location for Potter's Field, they would be throughout the cemetery. In 1892, an additional 3 blocks of new lots were added in the northwest portion of the cemetery. The addition added 200 more lots to the plat. A 20-foot avenue encircles the block in widening curves with an 8-foot walk on each side. Lots of the avenue are 16 by 20 and sell for $50. Smaller lots for $35. The greenhouse yielded an excellent income to help support the cemetery. March of 1894, it was declared that all of the bodies had been removed. The last work being done in March 31st, 1894. 366 removals were done, and only about 30 bodies being claimed at that point. The rest were buried throughout the city cemetery, the Riverside Cemetery. There were many ideas about what should become of the old cemetery, including the suggestions that the ravine from Pearl Street all the way to the cemetery should be turned into a city park. The trustees were given authorization to sell the old cemetery grounds in 1889. The Cemetery Association paid taxes on the Pioneer Cemetery property until its sale in 1900. John Hedinger, president, and Edward C. Schmidt, vice president, purchased the property for $500. In 1905, workers building a house on the west end of Edward Street, we know as Washington, discovered a pine box with a child in it. They found an additional child's skull with excavation of the site. This was the first discovery, despite the additional houses and lumber yards built on the site. Throughout the years, additional bodies were unearthed through the 1930s. So this kind of shows you that area of the cemetery. And here's all that building that they did at the time. 1903, the cemetery trustees traded Block M in the new additions for Block K, which was currently occupied by the old soldiers, and the location of Decoration Day was moved. The lots in K had become completely full. The new location on M would give the veterans more room for a monument and additional grave space. The 25 veterans buried on K were removed to Block M. Appleton began celebrating Decoration Day in 1868 at the Pioneer Cemetery in the honor of the Civil War veterans. Appleton continues today celebrating Decoration Day, now known as Memorial Day, with a parade and ceremony on Block M at the GAR Monument. The Grand Army of the Republic unveiled the new monument in 1925. The monument cost $2,000. So this is the Grand Army of the Republic monument here. And this is actually a columbarium that's kind of neat that was added so that there would be more space for veterans in here as everything else started to fill up. In 1906, the cemetery officers began planning for a chapel. A committee was put in charge of the arrangements. The committee included John McNaughton, George Miller, and Humphrey Pierce. The trustees approved the designs in March of 1910. The much-needed chapel and vault construction began. It was decided that the chapel would be erected near the main entrance to the cemetery where the old greenhouses were located. The vault will hold 40 bodies, and the chapel would seat 104. In August 1910, the pews for the chapel had arrived and the finishing touches were being put on the interior woodwork for the chapel and the office. The limestone walls and green Spanish tiles added a touch to the building. The structure would soon be ready for use. W.W. Waterman was the architect for the structure, and it cost $11,000. The chapel is currently undergoing restoration. The doors, windows, and interior all are being improved. It's a work that is still in progress, so you can definitely donate to that if you'd like. So you can contact the office. In 1911, Albert and Amy Priest gave the Cemetery Association $3,000 to construct a bridge over a new Riverside entrance to the cemetery. This was the second noble gift of this philanthropist couple. A.W. and Amy Priest also donated the Soldier Square Memorial Monument. As a part of the gift of the bridge, A.W. and Amy were able to choose the location for their mausoleum and move their family burial to that location. The bridge was removed in 1989 due to the deterioration and age. The bridge had a large stone chiseled sign that said A.W. Priest Memorial Bridge. That stone today sits behind Hearthstone, which was the home of Albert and Amy Priest. So if you haven't seen it out there, this is the Priest Mausoleum. The location, this is the original location of the bridge. So, and that is the original bridge. Kind of pretty, huh? Who wants to pitch in for a new bridge? Anybody? All right. Additional sections were added in 1903, 1905, and 1910. This 1917 map is a culmination of those additions. And you also see St. Joseph Cemetery in this one. Dennis Midam retired as superintendent of the cemetery after 51 years in 1924. Stephen Midam took over for a few months before he was fired. Yeah, his son didn't quite cut it, apparently. All right, so Midam remains optimistic after 51 years as the head of the cemetery. He was a veteran of the Civil War, and he retired from the job which he'd held for more than half a century. There are golden jubilees and golden weddings, but none so unique as that of Dennis Midam. His anniversary is spoken of as a golden wedding because he constantly speaks of his job as being married to the cemetery. He was hired originally for the Little City of the Dead, and he took charge over it for 51 years. Mr. Midam dug graves during the first few years of his employment, but had nothing to do with the work in the last 45 years. He hired it out after that. He accepted the employment from J.E. Harriman and was there for that full 51. Many family burials took place over the years. These pictures include burials of Joe and Carrie Steidel, Robert K. Kester, a baby. The Steidel plot is located on Block M, and the pictures are taken near, right around Memorial Day. The platform for the ceremony is erected in the background of the picture in the upper left. So you can kind of see, and some old cars. Earl Ballard and William Johnston are hired to be the caretakers of the cemetery. At this point, all of the graves are still dug by hand. Some new rules included that all boxes must be made of concrete. There no longer can be the use of a pine box. The cemetery markers are limited to 20 inches in height, and the monument dealers must confer with Mr. Ballard before a new stone can be erected. Earl Ballard reported in February 1929 that the cemetery vault was practically full. Under the current conditions, it takes a full day or more to dig a grave. This is the first year the vault had been so overcrowded with 50 bodies stored. In 1928, there were a total of 207 bodies buried in the cemetery. This picture is kind of neat because in the background, this picture still hangs in the cemetery office. So, Jesse Earl Ballard and his wife moved into the caretaker's house. They raised 5 daughters at this home. The back entrance to the home was the most used entrance, although the girls' dates were the only ones who would use the front. Across from the house, there was a field. They played kick the can, croquet, and more. Jesse Earl Ballard raised 350 peonies, a large vegetable garden, corn, and tomatoes there. Photo on the left is 1936 in front of the garage and shop area. The girls left to right are Arlene, Lavon, Nona, Jean, and Carol. The picture on the right was a recreation of the girls' picture in 2014 in order. Thanks to the family for sharing these great pictures. I had a chance to talk with Levon, Nona, Jean, and Arlene's son Terry Maves back in 2017. We talked for a number of hours about the cemetery. Growing up there was a neat experience. Many of the family members worked at the cemetery over the years, from the office to helping with Memorial Day preparations to digging graves. Their family cared for this amazing jewel of history. Some great family photos that were shared. And there's more in the back, so if you want to see some neat family photos, thanks to Terry and Mary for bringing those. Memorial Day was a beautiful and reverent affair. Earl got up at 4 a.m. on that day to make sure every veteran's grave had a geranium plant and a flag. The gates would stay closed until the time the parade entered. Earl would open the gates. In later years, Nancy Peterson led a group of volunteers to place flags on the more than 1,900 veterans' graves. I work with Paul Estat, Kay Fortin, and Cemetery Office Manager Holly Chacon to confirm veterans' records and organize the flags each year. Here's a shameless plug for volunteers to help. If you want to volunteer to place flags, we'd love to have your help. The veterans' work expanded to cemetery stone replacements and placards for those who pay the ultimate price, dying in service to the country. Joe Gerth-Hoffner has led an incredible couple of cemetery walks for us, and also created some incredible signage that explains a lot about different veterans who died in service that are buried at Riverside. And you can actually take that tour yourself. Those will be up for about a week and a half, and then they'll be back out again next year. So thanks, Joe. All right. Earl climbed to the top of the tower for these great shots. The photo on the left looking west up Pacific Street, which is known as Brook Street at the time. The photo on the right looking northwest from the tower. During Earl's tenure, this neat pamphlet on the cemetery was developed. The cemetery also added gates and iron fencing. The gates to the cemetery were then and now closed at dusk and opened at dawn. The entrance gained a water fountain and a pool at the base of the bell tower. The pool is currently filled with flowers each year. Earl Ballard retired in 1965 after 41 years of service to Riverside Cemetery. When Jesse Ballard retired, the following appeared in the Post-Crescent October 31st, 1965, entitled, "Never a Ghost, Says Cemetery Worker." Over 40 years in the cemetery and not one single ghost, alive or dead. That's the record claimed by the longtime cemetery worker, Earl Jesse Ballard, who at 72 will retire from his job as the manager of Riverside Cemetery in Appleton. "There's nothing out here at night to be afraid of," Ballard remarked last week when he asked to recall his experiences. "In fact, there's no place safer than a cemetery at night." Ballard admits he was somewhat apprehensive about taking the job as assistant manager back in 1924 when they hired him. "As a young fellow, I was reluctant to go with my parents to funerals. I was a little upset by dead people and didn't care to have too much to do with it," he said. However, he said, several months' duty with the Allied forces in combat in France had acquainted him with the dead and dying, so he was willing to try a cemetery job for $75 a month. Although Ballard cannot recount any ghosts he has come across in the cemetery, there have been a few strange goings-on his side of the iron fence. "Once I heard snoring behind a dirt pile, and it turned out to be a drunk. He was more frightened at being where he was than I was finding him. Halloween's always a big time, I think in the cemetery, Ballard said. Some human haunts would find pleasure in hanging a steel grave marker back in the cemetery during the long Halloween night. Other times, he said, he would find college students wandering the cemetery alone, looking for a missing clue in a scavenger hunt. One young student, a freshman, walked from tombstone to tombstone all night long before Ballard found him in the morning and helped him figure out the clues to his missing treasure. Twice, relatives have visited the graves of their loved ones and unfortunately did kill themselves there. One young man, after visiting the cemetery, walked into the river and drowned. Visiting a cemetery isn't as popular as it was in the past, he says, when he first began. We used to have them come every day and sit for hours. Some who were lonely used to talk to gravestones. Every grave in the sprawling 93-year-old cemetery is known to Ballard. He can, each Memorial Day, without checking the records, point out the location of most graves for inquiring visitors, and he is seldom wrong. Rudolph and Phyllis Blatecki were farmers from the Anago area. Rudy worked as a superintendent and Phyllis in the office. They were hired by the Cemetery Association in 1968. At this point, this is actually into the garage. The building has had renovations in the later years. Rudy and Phyllis brought many different species of trees to the cemetery after the cemetery suffered greatly from Dutch elm disease. The cemetery originally had over 185 elms, and only 30 were left after the Dutch elm disease. Rudy could fix anything and build up whatever the cemetery needed to get the job done. Rudy built a tree watering device on wheels that his daughter Peggy took from tree to tree, watering the new plantings. Rudy and Phyllis developed the tree walk that many students of Appleton schools can remember from the 80s and 90s. In 2025, the cemetery staff worked to recreate and expand the tree walk, creating a new map and new signage. More on that at the end. A new house was also built during the Blatecki's time at the cemetery. Rudy was a superintendent of the cemetery for 21 years. A few words from Rudy's eulogy. Rudy Blatecki was among many things a beautifully simple person. He found joy in the greatest of God's first that most of us take for granted. The trees, the birds, the squirrels, the flowers. He was a connoisseur of nature. Rudy was much loved among his employees at the cemetery where he and Phyllis worked. He took time to care for his employees, to know their needs, and to offer support. And his unselfish way with them won him in a highly respected place in their hearts. The Blateckis actually built, I believe, the house that's there. Since Rudy retired, many things have stayed the same and many have changed. Trees still come down and new trees are planted. New souls arrive for burial in a variety of ways. Rudy retired in 1988. Joe and Beverly Van Ryzen took over. Joe worked as the new superintendent of the cemetery and Bev in the office. Joe worked from 1993 to 2013. Judy Galt was the cemetery administrator from 1992 to 2001, and Mary Lehman from 2001 to 2014. Lance Zuliger was hired in 2016 as superintendent of grounds. He retired in 2025. Alex Radke succeeds him as the superintendent. Debbie DeBruin became cemetery administrator in 2016 and continues on today. Holly Chacon is the office manager. If you have any new recent cemetery questions, the staff there is incredible and they will be happy to answer any of your questions and really help you find a lot of information. There's also a neat tool called Burial Search where you can find locations of graves as well. This is the the Riverside Cemetery tree walk, the newest one. All the different locations of all different species of trees. So you can go out there and do that on your own. The maps, there are some maps in the back if you want to grab them, but there's also maps out at the cemetery that you can grab from the different book spots that are out there. So that's the tree map. And thank you to all the people who assisted me in preparation for this and research. Debbie, Holly, Terry, and then my conversation with all those awesome Maeve sisters, and my mom, Nancy Peterson, Ann Klein, and Joyce Heline had created a neat book with a lot of history. And of course, thank you to the board of directors who continue to take care of Riverside Cemetery along with the staff. So, and with that, I will take questions. Any questions about anything? Yeah. So St. Joe's is its own separate entity from Riverside Cemetery. So despite the fact that they're like back to back, St. Joe's is really its own thing. St. Joe's, I want to say 1878 is actually when St. Joe's started to be developed. So back in the day, you had the, what was the Catholic side? And the Lutheran side. Now I think you kind of see crossover, of course, people both being buried on both sides there. But they are separate cemeteries, so if you're looking for information, St. Joe's has its own office and own staff, and then Riverside has its own office and own staff. Question, Todd?
Who owns the cemetery?
The cemetery is actually a nonprofit, a 501c13 that is owned by the lot owners. So if you own a lot in Riverside Cemetery, you are an owner of the cemetery. They have an annual meeting, which is coming up in October 27th, Debbie, is that right? So if you are a lot owner, you can certainly attend that annual meeting. Yes.
I want to. That veterans plot ended up in both cemeteries?
I missed that. What was the
The
question?
veterans plot in both cemeteries, how'd that end up?
Oh, the Legion. So the Legion extends from both cemeteries. I don't know like the real exact history of that. That would be interesting to see if somebody from the Legion would have more details on how that ended up. Because it is, I mean, they do appear to be connected to each other. They were clearly planned at the same time. The Legion, I believe, owns that lot. So it's possible that they purchased their section in Riverside and then purchased a section right next to it in St. Joe's. But that'd be an interesting research project if you're up for it.
I can add to that.
Oh, go ahead. You want to come up here, Debbie? I'm just going to have, Debbie is the current cemetery administrator, and so she certainly can answer some of these questions probably better than I can, so we're going to bring her up here to answer some, so. Yeah, thank you.
So Riverside Cemetery donated some of the sites to the American Legion. And then a couple of years ago, they were not being utilized, and American Legion donated some sites back to us for veterans, for traditional burials. So I'm not sure the St. Joseph side, but I know the Riverside Cemetery part.
Awesome. Other questions? Yes.
I'm just curious of the funding, where the funding comes to keep it going. I mean, if you buy a lot and you're dead, you were an owner, you're not asking them for money anymore. So how does the perpetual funding come to maintain it?
Yes, this is a Debbie question, not a Gwen question.
I don't know. So when someone purchases a grave space, 15% of the purchase price goes into our perpetual care fund. So the perpetual care fund has $1.5 million for the continuing care of the cemetery.
And how many spaces are left there to be purchased?
So the cemetery the map of the cemetery that's plotted now, we have about 1/3 grave spaces still available for purchase. And then we have the undeveloped land to the north or towards Wisconsin Avenue.
So it's like 8,000 to 10,000, like in that third, do you think?
Yeah, it's 9,000,
In the current plot?
yeah. About 9,500.
Is your question, Mary?
In one of the previous maps, it showed the streets, and Lemonwa Street was named Lemonway Street. When was that changed?
That one might just be like a typo from that, because I think it's just like a spelling thing, like Oasis sometimes had 2 S's, sometimes it didn't. So I think it's more like that kind of thing, so just probably spelling related.
Are you seeing a downturn in people being buried in cemeteries? I've known a number of people that were cremated and they just keep their remains at home, and people don't go to visit the cemeteries like when my parents used to go at least every Memorial Day, stuff like that, to the gravestones. Are you seeing a downturn in that business part of it?
So cremation is increasing, in some communities more than others. So cremation is increasing. I know at the Wisconsin Cemetery Convention in La Crosse this year, one of the presenters said 1/3 of the urns are being scattered, 1/3 being held at home, and 1/3 making the final resting place at a cemetery. So obviously people making those decisions following cremation, and that's why we have the columbariums also, another option for above ground placement of urns in the veteran area and in Block N, the columbariums.
How many do those hold?
The veteran columbarium is 96, and then we have 3 columbariums in Block N that are 72 niches per columbarium.
Steve?
When did they get all the people out of the old cemetery to the new cemetery? And if not, was that because some of the families of the old cemetery folks did not want them disturbed?
So you could not leave a loved one there if you knew that they were there. So, you know, I'd like to tell you that they were all moved, but I would define the records as a little bit unknown in that era. Certainly, I think they tried, and it's possible that they were all moved because when you think about like that construction that happened into the 1930s, they may have like then sort of come across like all the burials at that point. I will tell you, I was a little surprised when the Post Crescent was like redug that they didn't come across anyone. But you know, the Post Crescent area was dug pretty deeply, and they did not come across anyone. So, but there's some area there yet that is sort of a question mark. So, it would not surprise me if at some point there was maybe a few that were not. But it's hard to say. So, they do, you know, they know roughly that it was somewhere around like 700 transfers over all of those years. But you're talking from the first transfers in 1873 through like, you know, the 1930s, but most of those transfers happened in that like 1889, 1891 time frame.
So do all those 700 have a marker?
They do not. So it's a mix of really old markers. There are some very old markers in there. So certainly, like when you walk into the cemetery, you're thinking, okay, started in 1870, but then I'm going to walk past this marker and it says died in 1850. So you can find a lot of those markers still. One of those oldest markers is Beach, and that one is still readable in there with the 1850 date on it. Another one that you see a lot is the Amos Story one. Amos died in 1862, and then he was a transfer to the new cemetery. So, and a big proponent of the new cemetery. So I'm imagining he was pretty pleased when he was transferred to the new cemetery.
Other questions?
Jim?
The burial records that Riverside has concerning the transfers, does it have information regarding where they were in Pioneer?
It does not. I can answer that. No, there are no records of the original locations at Riverside Cemetery. Do those records exist possibly somewhere in someone's basement? They might. So, because those cemetery association fellows are not the same people who were there during that 1872 time frame through that other time frame. So the records could exist out there. Certainly, I was surprised to find that map. That was actually at the person who had found that map actually found it at the county. And so could the county be hiding some of those records? It's possible. So but yeah, those particular Pioneer records are not something that was transferred to Riverside. When they started confirmed the new cemetery association, the records kind of start from that point, 1871, and then they went backwards with stones essentially to put in dates, because then they'd have, family members transferring and saying, Amos died in 1862, and then they'd, put that information in there for that transfer, that part of the transfer record.
So I'm sorry, so they do have record of if they're a transfer or not, they just don't have record of where in the Pioneer Cemetery they were?
Right, no record of where they were in the Pioneer Cemetery, but record of where they are now by name in the new cemetery. So, the ones that
And
they're
recorded as a transfer.
Well, so it's pretty obvious because anybody who was who died before November of 1872 is a transfer. So they're not like labeled that way though. Like it's just you'd be able to find it. Yeah.
Yes.
Is there any plan, like in the future, to get a grave marker on any of those unmarked sites?
So there's a big effort for starting with the veterans. So over the last 5 years, any of the veteran stones that were either in very bad shape or completely missing a marker, there's a team of people who've been working on that to actually put new stones in. I want to say there's been like right around 15 or 18 stones replaced or like marked that were never marked before. So starting with the veterans, there's an effort from that. Certainly it's something that we'd love to see. I've seen a few family members that come back and they want to mark those locations. So they'll come and find out that, grandma has a stone, but grandpa doesn't. And then they'll say, hey, we want to, get a stone for grandpa so that there is this kind of neat mark, on the earth of their last resting place, so.
No, I noticed that when you replace those original Osborne ones, is that the word, is that their name? You lifted their, can you have a flat?
Yeah,
Bring
there's a whole section in the cemetery that is all flush mount markers. And then that's a particular section. Do you know what number that is?
24 and 27 is flush markers only.
So this is a map of the cemetery with the sections. 24 and 27 are the flush marker only sections. The rest of these you can have anything that's within whatever the rules are right now.
I think she was referring to Orbison.
Oh,
But that was.
oh, sure. So the Reverend Orbison one, somewhere along the way, some of the cemetery stones that were damaged got flipped down. And so that is why that Orbison one was flipped down. So there has been a concerted effort throughout the cemetery to start pulling those up, raising them up. Debbie's really been leading the charge to make sure we're taking really good care of the cemetery. So I'm super appreciative, Debbie, of everything that you do to, take care of everything. So there is an effort to kind of pull things up and take care of them, and so it's neat. Yes.
There's a cemetery in the corner of Evergreen and Richmond called Pioneer. Is
Sure,
that any
Grand Chute Pioneer, yeah.
Yes.
So not related to this, that's the Grand Chute Pioneer Cemetery. So it has, its own records. It was its own cemetery association, completely separate from it. It's confusing though. Yeah.
Oh,
Any other questions? Okay.
I don't really have a question, but I'd just like to say it's beautiful out there. And every time I'm out there, it's just extremely heartwarming because a lot of my family is there. And I feel like it's so respectfully taken care of. Also, what I'd love to see is all the people that are just jogging through or riding their bike through, or it's a very alive place also. I guess I'd like to see that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. It is a beautiful space out there, and we're so thankful to have through the years, what I kind of read for you, they were arguing over this cemetery and how important it is. If you have a good cemetery, you can say you're, culturally appropriately taking care of things, which is kind of neat. So, yeah.
How large is the cemetery and the new expansion, out to the Wisconsin Avenue? How large is the whole cemetery?
It's 96 acres. Any other questions? Lynn?
Also unrelated to actually the cemetery is, as you were telling the story, a lot of the things you were saying was, this street used to be this street. Is there a place where you can find out why they would change the name of Fisk to Washington, or any specific reasons for street name changes?
So they changed some of the street names in the early days, 1853 they changed some, 1857, and then really the big name changes come around 1925 when they realigned the plats. So when you look at, I'm just gonna bust back to that first map. When they actually pulled the plats together here, This alignment meant some of these names like bumped into each other. So in 1925, they went and readdressed the entire city and then changed a whole bunch of names at that point that were sort of bumping into each other over the years to just make it easier to understand where you were. In some cases, though, people were still here. And so, for example, Packard runs into North Street. Well, the Packards were still here, so they didn't lose their street name. Winnebago ran into Gilmore. The Gilmores, not here. They lost their street name. So depending on the situation, the street names often were changed. If you grab a 1925 directory, it will actually show you new and old addresses as well as changes in the street names. It's kind of a neat resource for being able to find your way back to both addresses and also those street name changes over the years. Thanks for coming out. Have a great night.